In this lecture, we're looking at John Wesley and the context and the contours of his theological vision. And to understand Wesley, we have to really kind of pitch him over against his contemporaries. Wesley's theology is one of the most important movements in the New World. It shapes the context of American evangelicalism. And to begin, we're going to spend this lecture comparing and contrasting Wesley with one of his close friends, in fact, one of his closest friends outside of his relationship with his brother Charles. And the man we're talking about is George Whitefield. Whitefield was a man born in the western areas of England who really crisscrosses a lot of the development within England as well as the developments within the New World and the Great Awakening. Now, with respect to Whitefield himself, in our next lecture on the Great Awakening, we're going to actually look more deeply at his life and his context and his ministry in England, as well as in the Americas. So we're not going to go into his biography so much right now, as we are going to go into his theology on the subject of predestination, as well as his relationship with Charles and John Wesley. And there's a couple of reasons why we need to compare and contrast these two men. This is not simply an anachronism, nor is it simply looking at two old people who are long dead, whose theologies really are not all that important in the majority of people's minds. Rather, what we're looking at here is the ongoing development of the Protestant vision of not only the doctrines of grace, but also of pastoral ministry itself. Wesley is the man who recovers and restores the important place of Arminianism within the life of Protestantism. Now, we should recall that in our lectures on the Remonstrance faith, on the Synod of Dort, and on classical Arminianism, that these doctrines, in the context of the Netherlands, were stamped out. Not fully. There is still a Remonstrance church. There are still Dutch Arminians. Rather, what we're looking at here is the real flowering of Arminian thought in the person of John Wesley. And a lot of this is shaped by his personal beliefs, as well as by the context there in England of the dissenting groups and of the desire for holiness. Now, a lot of the groups that we talked about all throughout this period of time, the dissenters, all the variety of different stripes, some big, some small, you can't say that many of them are Arminian in the main. What they all share, though, is a commitment to holiness, a desire to see the Christian life lived out, to see sanctification applied, and to see the Holy Spirit come upon the person and to release them day by day from the power of sin. Where Wesley fits into all this, though, is he is a man who is going to stress a new paradigm, a new theological grid, if you will, as to how we're going to understand the call for holiness in the Christian life. Now, the subject here is a bit murky at first. Wesley and Whitefield are close friends, and we told the story in our last lecture as to how Wesley moves to the city of Oxford for the second time, this time to be a lecturer, and he joins the Holy Club, the club that Charles and others had got going as a method, hence the name Methodists, for the ongoing application of sanctification to the Christian life. They practiced fasting, prayer, really intense prayer, as well as a number of things that, in the modern vernacular, we might say, affects our spiritual formation. Well, as John takes off and as he is gone from the city of Oxford, it's around this time that Whitefield comes to reside in Oxford as a student. And so really, the first relationship that is built between the Wesleys and Whitefield is there in the context of the Holy Club. Whitefield himself actually joins, and he and Charles become really good friends. Whitefield was a poor man. He had to work his way through college, and Charles really looked after him. When both the Charles brothers were gone, they actually left the leadership of the Holy Club to Whitefield himself. They trusted him. He was a friend. They had not yet come to a real resolution on the fact that the three of them had different theologies, that the Wesleys were Arminian and that Whitefield himself was a Calvinist. Now, a lot of this is because Whitefield is only really beginning to understand his mind. He had instincts scripturally, and he began life as a pastor and as a speaker, a revivalist speaker, long before really he could even say or describe his faith in any particular way. And Whitefield goes over to the Americas and he preaches, in particular, the Great Awakening. And around this time, as Whitefield is going back and forth And as he makes the acquaintance of New England Puritans and becomes really something of a friend to Jonathan Edwards, Whitefield begins to see himself more and more as Reformed, more as a Calvinist, you might say. Another way of looking at this, though, is not to see that he is somehow infected with Calvinism. Rather, you have to see Whitefield as a more or less traditional Anglican on these subjects. Some of the books say that Whitefield is a moderate Calvinist. Well, that's a bit of a misnomer. You might say, rather, that he's Reformed, but he is not personally involved with the Synod of Dort or with the development of certain complex interactions with the doctrine of predestination that were occurring in either the Swiss regions or in the Netherlands. Whitefield is an Anglican. He's part of the Church of England. And we need to recall here that the 39 Articles, the governing small, short confessional that had been in effect since the time of Elizabeth I, does speak positively of the doctrine of predestination. It does say, in no uncertain terms, that it is God who elects to salvation. Now, it doesn't go on from there. It doesn't mention double predestination, as it's called, which is the doctrine of reprobation, the idea that God also somehow chooses those who are damned. But the 39 Articles are, you might say, in the main, they are Reformed. Or at the very least, you could say that the 39 Articles embrace the early Protestant understanding that it is God who chooses, God moves first, and it is God who gives us a heart of flesh, taking out the heart of stone. Well, Whitefield is in this line. He talks pretty openly about God having chosen us, God having rescued us. Well, the relationship between the Wesleys and Whitefield begins to sour roughly around 1739. It's in this year that Wesley first preaches and then publishes a tract entitled On the Freedom of Grace. And this is Wesley's coming out party as an Arminian. He speaks very negatively about the doctrines of predestination in general. And part of his main argument, and this is really the argument that all Arminians begin with, is he believes that the doctrine of predestination in any form makes God the author of evil, it makes him a tyrant, it makes him the one that is causing or provoking sin. Well, this text did not arrive in a vacuum. Part of what's driving this is the relationship between the Wesley brothers and George Whitefield. Whitefield had been going up and down the British areas in places like Bristol, preaching revival and calling for the new birth. And he'd been having a lot of success at it. A number of conversions were beginning to happen. In fact, Whitefield is known up and down England as the boy preacher, the young man with the amazing voice that can draw the crowds in and whose preaching was especially blessed with lots of fruit and lots of conversions. Well, it's in the context of a struggle over who is going to lead the new charge for the Holy Club and this Methodist movement. Who is going to define its theology? Now, obviously, the Wesleys were there from the beginning. They were the ones who led the Holy Club, who founded the Holy Club, at least with Charles personally. And they believed that their own leadership and their own perspective was to be the guiding principle as to the direction of the new Methodist societies. What had been going on just around 1739 is Whitefield and the Wesleys began to privately have lots of, frankly, tense conversations about the doctrines of predestination and Arminianism. And Whitefield really won't buckle. He sees himself as equally part of the leadership and equally capable of doing ministry on his own and leading the Methodist movement on his own apart from the Wesleys. The Wesleys, of course, believe that it is their vision that should be the dominant one. And so when Wesley drops this sermon and then eventually publishes the sermon on the freedom of grace, it really drops like a lead balloon for Whitefield. He feels that now the situation has been made very tense. And from about this time, again, from let's say roughly 1738 until the early years of the 1740s, Whitefield and the Wesleys are just bashing it out on these issues. Now, they're doing so in private. We know all of this from letters and from their own accounts of these moments later in their lives. They're not having, public debates or knock-em-out fights in the hallways or up on the stage in front of everybody. And John's not the only one. Charles, around this time, writes one of his most famous hymns called Wrestling Jacob. And Charles writes a very famous line in this hymn in which he says of God that, quote, "Pure universal love thou art." Now, what's interesting about this hymn is in the printing of it, Charles makes a point to capitalize every one of these words, driving home the point. His Arminianism, as well as John's Arminianism, is going to be the focal point of their pastoral theology and the context of their worship. Wesley goes a step further, and he actually publishes on the freedom of grace in the Americas. And frankly, this is an important point because just as 1740 gets underway, you have the emergence of the Great Awakening, which we're going to look at in a later lecture. So just as the Great Awakening is getting underway, Wesley sends over to the Americas to be printed one of his most important tracts on the defense of his personal theological positions. Now, Whitefield finds all of this to be a betrayal, and he finds it unseemly, personally, that his friends have made it a point to publicly, in their writings, condemn the theology that they know he holds. Well, to respond, Whitefield is invited on Christmas Eve, 1740, to come and preach a sermon at the new Wesley headquarters in the heart of London. And in a somewhat showy display, Whitefield, there up in the pulpit with Charles Wesley right beside him, preaches very openly and very passionately on the doctrines of election and predestination. Now, I think the way we need to see all of this, from 1738 up until about right now, is you have three really headstrong, immature young men who are passionate about what they believe, who are not buckling on what they believe. But there is no villain and no hero here. This is a personal fight, some friction that is going on here. But it needs to be pointed out that they have not yet broken faith. They have not broken fellowship. They are coming increasingly to loggerheads as they debate and dispute on these issues. But what they are not doing is condemning and throwing out the other one. It does, though, begin to increase, and there is some development towards this end. In the heart of London, of course, as I just mentioned, there is the Wesleyan headquarters, also known as the Foundry. Just up the road, there is founded the Tabernacle, which would be part of Whitefield's camp within the Methodist movement. And this is important to note. At this point, internally, yes, within the committed Methodists, within the leadership and those there in the heart of London, there is a split. In fact, they take on two different names. The Wesley brothers form the United Societies, what will eventually become known as the United Societies of Wesley. Well, Whitefield has another group of the Methodists, not a small number by any means, who are called the Calvinist Methodists. Now, students always get a chuckle at that. Calvinist Methodist is oxymoronic for a lot of people in the modern world. Obviously, the ongoing legacy of the Methodist movement was shaped by the Wesley brothers, and in particular by John Wesley. So to see here in the 1740s a group called the Calvinist Methodists always strikes people as a bit strange. Well, in this day and age, right here in 1740, there really is no telling where things might go. Internally, there is a split. At some point thereafter, though, the two sides come to a point where they agree to disagree. They both commit to ceasing to fight about this, to be enemies. They don't want to grow to be enemies. They want to remain friends. They want to remain colleagues. And so what they decide to do is not to talk about it. They're going to let it go. The relationship is improved shortly thereafter by the fact that Whitefield eventually relinquishes control and leadership over his side, the Calvinist Methodists, there in London. Over time, this group will either separate fully from the Methodist movement and go by a different name. So there's a group that eventually becomes known as the Welsh Presbyterian Church that comes out of this. If any of you have heard of the name Martin Lloyd-Jones, you will know someone who comes from this later break-off group known as the Welsh Presbyterian Church. Well, this is started by Whitefield originally, back in the 1740s. They were known as the Calvinist Methodists, and eventually some leave the societies entirely over this split in doctrine. The Wesleys, though, remain put there in London. And more importantly, now that Whitefield has stepped aside as leadership of a different faction within the Methodist movement, they now are in a better place to carry on the friendship with their good friend George Whitefield. And again, we want to stress the relationship component here is key. These are not simply people arguing in a vacuum. Whitefield actually writes of a prayer evening that he and Charles had had together, in which he says they were just simply bathed in tears, that they wanted to make sure that the relationship was strong. They wanted to come to the same conclusion. They were unable to. And so in the end, they gave everything over to prayer. and they kept the relationship, though they never came to an agreement on these doctrines. Whitefield around this time also quotes from a pretty standard line about the situation, in which he says that the three of them have agreed to, quote, stick to the grammar school of faith and repentance, rather than graduate up to the university discussions of predestination and reprobation. Again, they're going to agree to disagree. They're not going to make this issue the dividing line when all three of them are committed to revival and to the new birth preaching. Now, we'll finish the story before we get into Wesley's theology in particular. What happens over the next several decades is Whitefield becomes more and more enmeshed in the Americas. He travels up and down by horseback mostly, preaching the new birth all throughout North America. In many ways, he has detached himself from the British context, not out of fear or out of a relinquishing of his desire to see the British world grasp the gospel or to be involved there, but rather he had a heart for a kind of vagabond life, an itinerant preacher going just about anywhere where the gospel could be heard. And the Wesleys, being more organizing geniuses there in London, eventually, of course, carry on what will become the Methodist Church. Now, in the end, in 1765, Wesley himself writes the final cherry on top book called A Short History of Methodism. And by and large, most people understand the story of the 1740s only from this book. And it's a good book, and Wesley is very charitable within it. But of course, Wesley's writing long after the situation has resolved itself, long after the Wesley brothers have become the official leaders of Methodism, and Whitefield has moved on to the Americas. So, of course, the book is going to be more in favor of Wesley's position, and it's going to tell the story more as a victory of his theology over against that of Whitefield. Wesley does say in this book that it is Whitefield who is the first to challenge and to bring up the issue between the three of them. And that certainly may be the case, but of course, the Wesley brothers held firm and were equally as punchy in those early years when the fight was just getting underway. What's important about this story, though, is the three of them remained friends until the end of their life. The last year of his life, in 1770, Whitefield actually reached out to Charles again, and he writes one of the most friendly and ironic and passionate letters between two men who had radically different views theologically. And he describes, quote, the indissoluble union between the two of them in heart and Christian affection. He sends along a token of his love, his brotherly affection for the Wesleys, and, more importantly, when Whitefield did pass in 1770, it was none other than John Wesley himself who preached the funeral. So again, let me stop and just point out the fact that these positions, which have perhaps a bit too much in the modern world been the grounds for nasty statements and breaking of friendships and fellowships, those of us who have been part of any of this could really learn a thing or two from the Wesleys and from Whitefield here. While both sides are committed to their perspective, the fact remains is that though they no longer remain capable of doing organized or institutional ministry together, the fact remains is that they were friends until the day that they died. And so their relationship was shaped more by the union of their faith together in Christ and by their commitment to evangelism than it was marked by the breaking of friendship over differences of doctrine here on the subject of predestination. Well, what was Wesley's theology? If it's this important in the context in particular of North America, but as well as in Britain and in other parts around the world, what did Wesley actually teach about the subject of free will, grace, and Christian holiness? Well, we need to go back to the comments that we were making in our last lecture about Wesley's life. We said there that John Wesley's commitment to the idea of Christian holiness, or to sanctification, have at times caused people to doubt whether or not Wesley is fully Protestant, maybe? They certainly doubt that he is Lutheran. Well, we want to consider that. The fact of the matter is that Wesley does have a number of differences with the earliest Protestants in terms of their tendency, in particular Luther's tendency, to separate justification from sanctification very aggressively. Now, of course, in that context, in the 16th century, those Protestants coming out of the medieval world were very allergic to the subject of combining a conversation about good works with the topic of justification. Luther in particular stressed a pretty radical distinction between works of the law, following the law on the one hand, and the subject of justification and the work of Christ on the other. Well, when we look at Wesley's theology, we need to acknowledge that he does affirm, in no uncertain terms, this essential understanding of justification. Wesley actually has a book entitled Justification by Faith. In it, he affirms all of the same doctrines by name that Luther and the Protestants do. He comments on how it's the work of Christ, not the work of our sanctification, that matters. He talks about the imputation of Christ's righteousness, which is a word that means the covering of our sin by the righteousness of Christ. So he is absolutely on that wavelength. He has not rejected by name any of the doctrines of justification by faith that were associated with the Reformation. What's different about Wesley's theology, though, is what he sees the result of justification as being. Again, to stress, Luther is allergic to discussing justification in a way that makes works or sanctification required. This is more of a pastoral point for Luther. Luther is concerned, and in his day and age, he's rightly concerned, and Lutherans would say that we should be concerned about this at any time in the church's history. But for Luther, from a pastoral standpoint, he's very concerned about the slippery way that we begin with justification, but then we slip into talk of sanctification in a way that makes it sound as if we're not justified without good works. It's one of emphasis, one of the accent that he places on justification. Now, anyone who has read Luther, of course, will find all kinds of places where he does talk about good works, but he will not discuss them in the context of justification. He really stresses the need, pastorally in particular, to keep these separate. To use a practical example, Luther says essentially that our wills, even after conversion, if they hear that there are obligations that require someone to be sanctified, Luther will see in this a code word or a shorthand expression of the idea that what we're communicating, even if our words don't suggest this, but what we are communicating is that justification is only the beginning of our salvation, so that we get in by Christ's work, but we stay in by our works. Now again, Wesley's not going to say this. He's not going to go to this point. He's going to come close to it, and he's certainly going to push this boundary. So in a way, you might say that Wesley is fundamentally Protestant. He has not rejected the Protestant message, but what he has rejected is the pastoral application of Luther's, that you do not talk about sanctification or holy living in the context of the Christian life. He is not allergic to that. In fact, he thinks it is required that you talk about Christian good works and sanctification. So for Wesley, justification is the door to sanctification. It is the foundation upon which you build the life of the Christian. And the way Wesley gets at this, again, by rejecting the Reformed or even the Lutheran understanding of predestination, is he begins to talk about something that's called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is somewhat akin to the Arminian understanding of the way in which God sort of halfway redeems or illuminates or frees all people in this world from the blindness of sin. Prevenient grace is when God works first to give us the freedom of the will, so that when we hear the gospel, we are able in that freedom to choose God and to choose the gospel. So very much like the Arminians of the 17th century, Wesley here in the 18th century will say that we have freedom, but it's not a simple freedom that we have just because we're born. Instead, Wesley will say, God works first to give us the freedom to choose. And then when the gospel comes, we are able to choose thereafter. One way of seeing this is that up until this point, Wesley is not all that different from classic Arminianism. Where he does differ, though, is the application of the gospel with this talk of Christian perfection and holiness. One of Wesley's more enduring conceptions about the Christian life is that those who have been imputed with the works of Christ must subsequently be imparted the works of Christ by the operation of the Spirit. Now again, this is right where Luther would react, that the imputed work of Christ should not be carried over into the discussion of imparted or the infusion of Christ's work into our hearts. Again, Luther's not concerned with good works or with sanctification itself. He's concerned with the pastoral placing of these things side by side. In his mind, this would confuse. Luther would say that this would result in the person not trusting in the work of Christ, but only in their own works as they see them worked out in their own Christian life. However, for Wesley, this is where he goes. This is absolutely part of his theology. And there are a couple of code words that he uses, a couple of jargon or slogan form things that he repeats throughout his writings and in his sermons as the description of the Christian life. One of the most important ones is he talks about the idea of Christian perfection. Now, in all of my teaching, this idea of Wesley's understanding of Christian perfection is probably one of the most misunderstood phrases and theological concepts in really the history of, at least the history of Protestantism, if not all throughout church history. Wesley is using perhaps a bit of an unfortunate phrase here. Obviously, for a lot of people, the word perfection doesn't speak of levels or progress of any kind. To be a Christian who is perfect sounds as if what Wesley is saying is that the person is completely free of sin, unable to sin, and almost as if he is living in the eschaton on this side of heaven. And Wesley talks about this in the light of something that's called the second work of grace. And there are ongoing different ideas related to this as the holiness movements develop in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some in the modern world, for example, refer to the baptism of the Holy Spirit, a second grace, a second blessing, something like this. Well, this is very much part of Wesley's theology. In fact, in many ways, it comes directly from Wesley's theology on into the wide variety of holiness movements that exist in the modern world. What Wesley means by Christian perfection, or this second gift of grace, is not so much perfection in maybe the modern 21st century jargon, as it is, I like to use the word victory over sin. Wesley is very clear about this. This idea of Christian perfection is not sinless perfection. Rather, the perfection that is in play here, or the idea of perfection, is that the Christian can be so in step with the Spirit, so in love with the gospel and with Christ, that the narcissism within us becomes, at least for a time, done away with. And Wesley gives all kinds of little shadings of this. He'll say things like, those who are perfect are either those who have achieved a final perfection, in which they have killed their own desires and are putting others first in every circumstance that they find themselves in, or it's those who are progressing towards that perfection. So you might say that Wesley has a bit of a play on words here. He's saying that there are those who are perfected and those who are not, but both are perfect. As long as one has the Spirit working within them, they have the opportunity for victory over sin. Well, let me give you a concrete example. Wesley might say, if he were approaching someone who was an alcoholic, and this person has come to the faith, Wesley is not the man who's going to sit there and say, well, you're an alcoholic for life. There's really nothing we can do about it. We're just going to sit back and wait for Jesus. He's also not going to continue to say that it's okay. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep on with the alcoholism, and let's see how that goes on. You're loved by Jesus just the way you are. No, Wesley's going to say that you can have victory over that. The Christian, he might say, does not have to be an alcoholic. He or she can have some victory over this. Now, repeatedly, Wesley does ground this in the activity of the Spirit. He is not talking about full Pelagianism, as if the Christian who ceases to be an alcoholic has done so by their own strength or by their own merit. You might say again that Wesley is an optimist when it comes to the work of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit will work. The Spirit is working. And even if you're progressing, even if there are all kinds of ways in your own life where that victory over sin is not being recognized, Wesley will still say you are on the path to Christian perfection. There is a teleology, there is an end point for you. Not simply remaining who you are, but becoming more and more the restored image of God. And again, he is very clear on this. He is not talking about sinless perfection. In fact, he published a little book on this entitled A Plain Account of Christian Perfection. And he entirely abhors the idea that anyone should read what he is saying as being the teachings of Pelagius. Now, he is certainly semi-Pelagian in the historic sense. That is, he believes that there is a great deal of our choice and our effort and our activity, not only in sanctification, but also in the embrace of the gospel after prevenient grace. But he is not talking about works righteousness. Again, Wesley has published a book on justification by faith. What Wesley changes and the pastoral application that he provides that then infuses Methodism and the holiness movement, and that over time becomes, frankly, one of the default positions of most evangelical denominations or churches, is this idea that there is a constant optimistic hope and belief that the Spirit is at work in us to improve our lives. And part of the real root of pastoral ministry, not only for Wesley, but for all Wesleyans ever since, is to see the improvement of society through the eradication of addiction, abuse, and all kinds of things that defile and destroy the image of God in us. You can look at just the history of Methodism and see repeatedly their attacks on slavery, their attacks on abuse and addiction, their real commitment to the equality of society. And you can see the implications of Wesley's theology here. He doesn't want anyone to sit back and say, well, I'm justified. I'm just going to sit around and wait, and I will share the gospel, but the gospel is simply about justification. Nope, he's going to say justification is the door to sanctification, and anyone who has the Spirit and who is being sanctified, Wesley will say, they have a goal or a teleos in front of them that is pulling them forward, and they will see victory in the course of their life. They will see a reduction and even an eradication of that narcissism that resides in the heart of us all. And in the end, whether in this life or the next, Wesley believes Christian perfection is always the goal.